It started to kind of wear me down, and I don't think I realized how burned out I was until I went to Calabria for this trip as a tourist. And then I started to think about like, wow, okay, I'm really burned out. I need to change my life.
When we talk about immigrants and numbers, we stop seeing people. But when we put faces to the stories, we can finally feel.
Actually, live in the south of Italy, I believe. So, how is it for you there? You're an American living in Italy. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What is that for you? How do you feel in south of Italy?
Well, I think that my experience has probably been a lot different than that of other Americans that have moved to Italy, actually because my family's of Italian descent, specifically from the South. There are some cultural things that are embedded in what happens in my family. So in terms of some of the cultural aspects, it wasn't so hard to adjust. Of course, I had to get used to speaking the language. I didn't know really good Italian when I moved there. It's certainly better now, but at the time I really didn't speak much Italian. And maybe you know, but in the South, in many parts of Italy, but in Calabria in particular, and in other parts of the South, there's a huge use of the dialects. And so that was also something I had to get really used to, and still getting used to. It's not perfect, that's for sure.
Did you spoke Italian at your house when you were in the US, or that's something you're just learning from scratch in Italy?
Yeah, I, like many Italian Americans, nobody in my family spoke Italian. It's really common generations down the line for people to lose the language. Nobody in my family spoke Italian. I actually learned Spanish first. I studied Spanish in school and then had many experiences learning Spanish. So I actually spoke Spanish first and then learned Italian when I moved to Italy. My Italian when I first moved to Calabria was really elementary. I could barely have a conversation, but we could kind of understand each other because Spanish and Italian aren't that far off.
Especially Argentinian Spanish.
Yeah, which I don't speak, by the way. I don't use both or any of that, but I can
Right.
understand it. I'm used to it.
Right. So, look, I watched a video about Italian American versus Argentinian Italians, and it's on your social media. I was very attracted about that topic because I explain people all the time what that is, and I don't think people quite understand.
Yeah.
So before we dive into that, can you? I want to ask you a question about yourself. Like, who was actually before Italy, and who is actually today in Italy? How did your life change today?
I mean, it's one of those things where it's kind of hard to even start dissecting it because there's just so much that's happened. I mean, the baseline is I'm an American. I would identify as an American. If people ask me, then I would say, yeah, okay, my background is Italian, just because my last name, often people ask me if I have Italian ancestry. I was an English teacher, and I've been an English teacher for a really long time. And of course, that influenced me a lot when I moved to Italy. But I actually didn't move to Italy in order to teach English. I moved there originally because and it's kind of a long story. I don't know if we have much time for this, but basically, I went as a tourist with my family just to kind of understand Calabria more. I had heard so much about it from my family members, but I had never been. So I went with my family members to see it for myself, get to understand the terrain, where we come from, the traditions. And my cousin and I went horseback riding at this ranch, where both of us have a background riding horses. So we went there to explore the Calabrian countryside on horseback. And again, my Italian was not good at the time, but apparently it was good enough that they offered me to come back and work for them the next summer, basically giving tours on horseback and interpreting from Italian to English and so on. So that was how I actually ended up in Calabria originally. And I wasn't teaching English at the time. I was just working with the tourists. So yeah. And I mean, things have just evolved from there. Now I just work as a teacher, studying. My specific area of research is in international relations, global affairs, specifically language and migration. That's my research area.
That's pretty cool, man. I love that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm passionate about culture, right? And how you know, being an English teacher, you know, teaching different cultures. I'm assuming, and then that uh, you know, drive you into what you're doing today. That's pretty neat, by the way. So. So Italy and the U.S. In comparison, culture, financials, how is that different for you, and how impactful it is? Are you more happy now in Italy, or you miss the U.S.?
Well, it's just a completely different lifestyle. You live in the US now, so I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's intense. I mean, depending on where you are regionally, it's more or less intense. Where I come from Idaho, which is a much smaller, more rural, but I lived in New York for a long time. That sort of hustle and grind culture. I loved it when I first moved there, and I did really well when I was living there. It started to kind of wear me down, and I don't think I realized how burned out I was until I went to Calabria for this trip as a tourist. And then I started to think about like, wow, okay, I'm really burned out. I need to change my life. And I was doing fine financially in the US. You know, that wasn't the main factor. In some ways, reflecting back, don't even really know what it was that I was looking for when I initially moved to Calabria. I kind of ended up there by chance and then started to formulate my own ideas.
You said, you know, I was financially good. Money wasn't the reason why, it wasn't the motive,
Yeah,
which
not
is an interesting
necessarily.
point, right? It's an interesting point because um, not everybody migrates because of money or move out of a country, you know, because of money, and that's I've seen a lot of people doing that right now, where they're probably looking for more time
Mm.
than having more things or more debt, for example.
Yeah, and actually, I make a point about this because I hear this a lot where people want to move to Italy or Spain or Portugal because they think that they're going to do better financially. And you may or may not, right? I mean, I'm in a privileged position where I work for myself. So I don't depend on finding a job, having someone pay me, or, I mean, in some ways, having your own business has struggles of its own, of course. Especially if you move to southern Italy and you're going there to work, I don't recommend doing that. It's
Right.
very difficult to find a stable income there. Unless, of course, you're part of the community, then I think it's easier. I think that a lot of, especially a lot of Americans, when they move to Italy, they're shocked at how difficult it can be.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with that. I interview a lot of people from all over the world, and some of them are smart enough to do what you're doing. Some of them, you know, find out the hard way. Yes, and I think that is why, you know, a lot of the stuff that we're doing is educating people, right? Where each day you're educating people what to do before they move to a foreign country. So the other thing I want to say, so you're an Italian descendant or Italian heritage, you know, from back in the day, but you're from Idaho. You're not from New York. Because when you think of Italian, you think of New York, right? Or New Jersey, right? Idaho is beautiful. I used to live in Utah next to Idaho, so I
Okay.
am very familiar with that area. I'm in Louisiana now. So anyway, that's great. Now that we kind of got that out of the way, we talk about Italy, the US. I want to dive into a topic that it hit me directly because I'm Argentinian, and you're American, and you have some Italian culture in you from your family back in the day. Right? You say a lot of things there that I felt they resonate with, right? And one is this stuff, you know. First of all, I'm not Italian descendant. That's number one. So my last name is Mino, so I'm more Spaniard. But I never knew I had some Italian in me, at least in body language, gesture, right? The way I spoke. I never noticed. I never know until now with social media and living in the U.S. where people try to find who to identify with, which it was a struggle for me. So let's talk about this stuff. I know you made this video about that, and you went to Argentina to learn about yourself. Can you touch on that? Explain, you know, why you decided to do this, and how was your experience in Argentina?
Well, the reason why I ended up in Argentina was mostly just because I made connections in Italy with Argentinians that had moved there, and eventually they moved back to Argentina and invited me to accompany them. So that was the reason why I went. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I went to Argentina. I Argentina is a complicated place. Just from my perspective, it's complicated in many ways. It's complicated ethnically, linguistically, certainly politically, culturally, economically. And if we think about the timeline when I was there at the end of 2023 into 2024. So it was like from December until the end of February, early March. And I mean, there was a major economic crisis. According to the people in my comments, that has changed and things have gotten a lot better. I don't know. I haven't been back to Argentina since, so maybe it's gotten better than what it was like when I was there. That was really, I think, the main culture shock. I was fine with the language, especially by the time I ended up in Argentina. I've been spending so much time with Argentinians. I lived with Argentinians in Calabria. So I was used to the language. I was used to the slang. That didn't shock me at all. And I've traveled a lot, so adapting to the culture wasn't a big deal. But yeah, the economy was what really shook me. It was really, really bad when I was there, and things were changing a lot. So, but I had a great time. I mentioned in the video that I posted that we went to football matches, which I had so much fun. That was one of the highlights. We went to several, I think maybe 5 during the time that I was there. Just Argentinians are so friendly and generous and warm. They're intense in the same way that I think Italian Americans and sort of stereotypically Southern Italians are too. So like that kind of intensity felt really familiar to me and made me feel at home. There were some interesting cultural things, like I mentioned in the video. I don't know if you remember the high context, low context communication, these kinds of misunderstandings. But otherwise, I had a really great time when I was in Argentina. It was so much fun.
So, I grew up I grew up in an English town, right? In Argentina called Ranelagh. I grew up over there and I went to an English school. I'm from Italian culture, pretty much English over there. But there's always these different, more than anything. First of all, I never knew that I identify as somehow have some Italian in me. Like I never thought about that. I know that in Argentina, like eating beef is a big thing. Italians, we eat pasta on Sundays, and I guess regular Argentinian or Spanish descendant Argentinians, we eat pasta on Saturdays and we eat the meat on Sundays. That cultural thing, it happened. And I also remember seeing Italian last name all over the place, but I never actually put any thought into it. And as a kid, at least in the 80s when I grew up, my school was just European European history, everything that is Spaniard or Italian, and very little of Argentinian history. I never understood why, like I never questioned, but I start thinking about all this stuff based on the video that I saw from you. But, there's such a thing when I took a class of economy when I went to college, it teaches about body language. We have all these, I remember doing this or this. There's a lot of stuff. And it wasn't unconsciously, like it wasn't, I never thought myself of, oh, this is Italian. How the Italians, because now you're Italian, what Italian thinks about Argentinians, because this is a very common, and we use words, like a leg, for example, we would call it gamba.
Mm-hmm.
And gamba is an
Sure.
Italian word, but I never processed information why we call it gamba or I don't know, many, fiaca when you're, I have fiaca today. That means that you're tired, you're lazy, you're feel like laid back a little bit.
Yeah.
And
Or
that,
even like
I never,
birra.
right.
Yeah. These are all Italian influences.
I never processed that. What did you learn about that while in Argentina? I never consciously start thinking about that until I come to the United States. And I want to share my experience about identity. First time in the U.S., I have an identity problem. Based on your study, what you learned, what do you find out about?
Well, yeah. And this is what's complicated about it, right? In Argentina, I think stereotypically, when you think about Argentinians, you think about the Argentinian intonation in the language. And a lot of people say that it mirrors Italian intonation, which certainly there's an influence from Italian into Argentinian speech, no doubt. Certain words, the flow, the word stress, and so on. So I kind of was anticipating that, but I guess what I wasn't anticipating was how deeply embedded Italian culture is in Argentinian society. So much so that It's a very interesting, and this is something that actually came up a lot in the comments, was that people don't identify as Italian, Argentinian, or even Argentinians of Italian, and like it's just part of they're just Argentinian, and that's just how they identify. And that's what I was trying to get at in the video, just that Italian culture is so prevalent there that it just Tina became very Italian in a way, in and of itself, whether or not people identify individually that way. And, that was something I wasn't really expecting. However, I do think, and this is something that I've heard a lot from Argentinians that I met along the way and also here in Italy, just how much they expected Italy to be a lot different than what it was. I think because similarly, the immigration periods to the United States and also to South America ago, and the Italy of that era just doesn't really exist anymore. It's changed and shifted a lot. And this is common. You've probably heard this a lot from people that are part of diaspora communities abroad. The homeland, the motherland sort of changes and adapts in many ways. And the people that move from the old country to a new place and settled, in some cases, retain that original culture. And that it takes on a life of its own. And so this is a similarity that I would say I noticed between the Italian American community and Argentinians, especially, again, the Argentinians I met in Italy. They were going to get their Italian citizenship finished. Thought Italy would be different because that's what they were told from their grandparents, or had heard from their great-grand. And so when they got to Italy, it was a bit of a shock. I mean, certainly still very Italian.
Right. I also noticed that the difference between, and I heard you saying this in one of your videos, how the Italian culture basically became Argentina on a way, but in the U.S. it wasn't as impactful. It's more about community than like impacting the entire United States.
Yeah, and I think that this has to do with how many people of Italian ancestry there are respective to like the population size, right? Because if we look at the data in the United States, people of Italian origin make up only 5 or 6%, versus in Argentina, again, there are lots of variations in the data. I'm just telling people what the literature says. It's somewhere between 45 and 65%, depending on who your source is. So, I mean, we're talking about at least half of the population with some kind of Italian origin. And even if they're not of Italian origin, it's still so deeply embedded in the society that people like you that otherwise don't have any Italian ancestry still have Italian characteristics. And that's not something we would see in the U.S. just because it's a much smaller percentage.
In the food, yeah, it's funny because in the U.S. people think that I eat taco or burritos. No. We don't eat spicy food. We don't eat spicy food. It also something that happened here. I wanted to talk about identity. I bring this up to you because when I came to the U.S. for the first time, I didn't know where I belong. First of all, Argentina in the 80s actually is not Argentina when you went, 23, 2024. It was much more European than it is today. And I'm not saying there is a good or a bad thing in a bad meaning. When I was growing up, we didn't have massive immigration like as Argentina had, and that shaped the culture. It was shifting, like the cumbia or the salsa. That was not in our culture. You could listen to cumbia. We knew it was from Colombia. It was from other countries, but nobody listened to it. I didn't grow up listening to it. Now we have Argentinian folklore, which is our national music, which is more Spaniard than Italian, and we have those in other states or provinces in Argentina. Also wasn't a big thing in Buenos Aires. I was more of a country side of Argentina. So anyway, coming in the 90s, early 90s with Maria mentality, I didn't know I don't know where I belong. When first instinct was, okay, so I pick Spanish, so I'm gonna meet with the Spanish people, but they were different than me. I didn't connect with them at all. Then I wasn't able to connect with Americans because I didn't speak the language and a completely different culture. I didn't know where I belong. And Argentina struggled with identity. A lot of times they think that we try to be European, or we try to be white. It's not something intentional. is an identity problem. What do you think about? I wanted to share that with you because I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that's something I experienced as a new immigrant in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really surprise me because I mean there are some major differences culturally. I mean, I don't know who we're talking about in terms of the other Latino people that you were coming in contact with in the U.S. If it was primarily Mexicans or Central Americans, but I mean, they're very different culturally from South America. Period. Especially Argentina has such a huge percentage of European ancestry that we still see culturally, right? That's not to say that a place like Mexico doesn't have cultural influences from Europe. Of course it does, right? But it's just different. These societies change. You mentioned something really interesting was that Argentinian society in the 80s was different. And that's something that people, for whatever reason, have trouble understanding is society, culture, language is always shifting, never fixed. That has to do with migration patterns, has to do with language influence, where people are coming from. It's a complicated topic. In terms of identity, it makes sense to me that you would have had trouble fitting in a little bit. And I don't know if you still feel that way, if that's changed. And it would be interesting to know why, if it has changed or who you have decided to fit into in terms of a group. Yeah, I mean, that kind of identity crisis, I think, is really common for a lot of people.
Yeah, so I couldn't connect with any Latin Americans other than Uruguayans.
Okay.
They were just like, yeah, pretty much. We almost identical. But then, yeah, it was just different. A lot of, also Argentina in the 80s. I don't know if it was the 80s or before the 80s. We were not part of Latin America. Politically speaking, we were not really part of Latin America. And that creates an image of what Argentinians were or are because of that. But we're not. Now Argentina in the past few years, maybe the past 10 years or more, are very heavily involved with Latin America. We're part of it. But so that's one thing. And today, I don't identify with a specific group. Friend with everybody. Like I have friends from all over the world. I learned the language here. I have more than 30 years in the US. One thing I learned was I had to learn the language and I had to learn the culture. So that helped me somehow belong to at least the American culture. But I talk to anybody. I don't really feel like I am part of the Latin American. I do identify as someone that speaks Spanish and Latino or I don't know. There's so many terminology right now. People get offended. You're Latino or Spanish. I don't know what I am. So that's the reality. Right now, that's what I am. I feel like I'm I connect with any culture. I don't belong anywhere. That's kind of how I feel.
Yeah, and these conversations online about identity, especially if we're talking about Italian, it's like people really want Italian Americans to understand that they are not Italians, okay? It's like these conversations become very contentious. The fact of the matter is that identity is very personal, right? If you're an American person like me that grew up in a family that ate Italian food and you grew up with conversations about your Italian ancestors and what it was like in the old country, these kinds of things, that's going to shape who you are as a person. When it comes to the online culture of talking about identity and all of that, people get really worked up about it. They get very defensive and very combative online. At the end of the day, it's very personal. Your experience as an Argentinian is going to be different from probably even your other family members, right? I mean, you having moved abroad, actually, that's going to shape and influence who you become as a person. So I like entertaining these kinds of conversations online because I think it makes for interesting discussions. But I do think that sometimes people take it way too seriously and,
Yeah,
it becomes so contentious.
I agree. I don't know why they take it too seriously. I don't really care. I think I think talking about this stuff is how we learn about who we are. But I think at least as an Argentina, I struggle with identity. I guess if I was in Italy, maybe I wouldn't struggle as much. I still struggle, but in the United States, we speak a whole complete different language. Um, a complete different culture. Also depends. United States, as much as Argentina, they're big countries. So if you go to New York, New Jersey, to Idaho, complete different people. I'm in
Yeah.
Louisiana. They have the Cajun Creole. It's a French. They used to be people still speak Cajun French. So there's also an identity issue right here.
Yeah.
Not even close to Italian, but more with the French culture, right?
Right. Yeah, and actually, in terms of my family's personal immigration pattern, they ended up coming through Ellis Island like most Italian Americans families did, but they ended up in California. So that's how we were on the West Coast. Okay, obviously they didn't go to Idaho directly. That was my parents decided to move
Right.
to Idaho. But yeah, my Italian ancestors ended up in California, and there's a huge community of people of Southern Italian ancestry that ended up in Oakland, San Francisco area. That's where my family settled. And so, even within the Italian American community, we talk about it sort of as this homogenous identity like Italian American. But East Coast Italian Americans in some ways are very different from West Coast Italian Americans. The language influence, there's a huge debate online. Do we call it sauce? Do we call it gravy? My family called it sauce. Somebody else in New York, when I moved to New York, I remember a lot of my New Yorker friends that were of Italian ancestry, they called it gravy. And I was like, gravy? What are you talking about? Gravy?
Right.
This is something that drives me crazy online, but people have a tendency to reduce things down and make it very simplistic. I mean, when you're talking about something as complex as identity and culture, language, it can't be that simple. There's no one singular factor to anything. You have to take a lot into consideration.
Right. I watched a documentary a while back where they were talking about immigration to the Americas. Italian or Spanish descendant people were splitting on the boat. Sometimes family would try to get it away from the war and just get on a boat the best way they could. Sometimes family would be separated. There's a lot of family that come to New York, San Francisco, all these places in the United States. Their family, half of their family or a sibling, some kind of sibling went to Argentina. They're connected somehow per bloodline or whatever. And I watch a documentary where they talk about that way, how they would try to connect. And that documentary, someone that was from the United States in Argentina, that connection too.
Actually, I have, this was one of the coolest parts of my time in Argentina was I have some distant relatives that they settled in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And unfortunately, I didn't get to meet the ones in Uruguay or Brazil, but I did get to meet the ones in Argentina. They live in Entre Rios. So I went up there. That was amazing. That was so cool to be able to connect with some distant relatives. We showed each other family pictures of our, and some distant like uncles, cousins, and whatever. And it was amazing how similar they look. It was incredible. It was such a fascinating. Actually, the one lady that I spoke to, we've been in contact for more than 15 years through Facebook initially. She contacted me through Facebook and we maintained this relationship. And when I finally got to meet her in person, it was, I don't know, almost like an out-of-body experience meeting a relative like that. Something I wanted to ask you, actually, because it came up a lot in my comments, and I'm not exactly sure why this happened, but anyway, on the video that I posted, I had a lot of people that were like, Argentinians are Americans too. It's not just the U.S. isn't the only country in America, and I totally agree with that. I totally get it, but at the same time, in the English, we just don't have a term to refer to ourselves as like American, like U.S. Americans, right? We always have to either hyphenate or make the distinction. And I just thought that was, I heard this a lot too in Argentina, but it's easier when you're navigating it in Spanish because we have a word estadounidense that, can compensate for that. So I just wanted to know from you, like, what's your position on that? How strongly do you feel about that point?
I don't know why, but I don't think like many other people. I don't get. It's important from an an identity perspective. Right? The reality is like the Americans. So if United States of America, it has America we call ourselves Argentinians. So I would call you. You can call yourself American because it says United States of America, right? If you will say,
Right.
I mean, I could call you, oh, you're United States. Oh, I mean, in Spanish, sound better, estadounidense. But in English, you can't just call someone United States. Oh, you United States. You can
Right.
say, oh, you're American. I think it's more of the way you rhyme, the way you say it. Is better. Um, we call ourselves Argentinians because we are. But the reality, to agree with you, because you're right, we all Americans. We all Americans because we descend from uh, somehow, not everybody I would say, but some people are mixed with indigenous in the Americas. Right? Certainly, that's a lot in Argentina, including the U.S. They have some indigenous blood in it, but all the ones that live here, we are Americans, and also
Yeah.
all countries got colonized too, not just the United States, not just North of America. Funny because since we're talking about this, it's always about identity. That's why the United States is so divided. That's why the Latin community is so divided because the Latin
Mm.
community is divided. It's divided
Yeah.
100%, and it's always come down to identity. I've been thinking about with the immigrant community in the United States, especially Latin Americans. They try to push for United States to be more Latin friendly, which it already is a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
But push their culture uh, into the Americas, and Americans don't have the right to fight the bat because they're not from here. So I have a say about that, and here's where I stand with this. So I think if you're Mexican or maybe even Canadian, if you're not Spanish
Yeah.
but you're Canadian, French, or people that live in Louisiana, which is Cajun, they have the right to kind of argue about that stuff. They're all from
Mm.
the north of America. But when you came from Argentina, you came from Peru, Uruguay, your countries were colonized. And I agree with that concept. If you want to argue who was here first, I think an Argentina should go to Argentina and fight for the indigenous in Argentina and fight who's first in Argentina because you were not born in the US, right? So I think it's
Mm.
uh, I put a lot of thinking about this kind of stuff because I think it's appropriate for people in the north of America to argue about this stuff because they were here for the
Mm.
longest. But Argentinians have their own battles. Peru had their own battles. They have a lot of indigenous, but they also got colonized. So
Mm.
we can have the same battles they have in the U.S. over there. But for some reason, the whole Latin community try to push that because I think when you don't feel like you belong somewhere, you want to change it. But it really goes in how you adapt to something, not changing something so you can adapt to it. You adapt to where you are. I
Yeah.
don't know what your thoughts are, but that's since you asked me, that's kind of overall how I think.
Yeah, I don't have a particular opinion on the fragmentation going on in the Latino community because at the end of the day, I'm
Hmm.
not I wouldn't identify as Latin American. Um, it is interesting what you mentioned that when people feel like they struggle with their identity, that they want to change it. It would be interesting to know what that looks like on a mass scale. What we see oftentimes, though, is that people end up in immigrant or migrant communities that, like, Argentinians end up going, or Mexicans end up in parts of the country where there are more Mexicans. And this certainly happened in most of the migration waves that we saw in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I think because there's safety within proximity to other people or other languages that are similar to yours. So that makes sense. So I don't know. I can't really speak to that, but I'm not surprised that there's fragmentation just because these are very different cultures. Mexican culture is very different from Colombian culture. Colombians are very different from Peruvians from Uruguayans. I mean, everybody is so different food. The accents are easily distinguishable if you speak Spanish long enough and you're familiar with them, right? You
Right,
hear someone from Colombia, you know they're Colombian, right? You
right.
hear someone from Mexico, you know. So what creates that? Those are linguistic, but um, so it doesn't surprise me at the end of the day that people kind of fragment.
Right, but it's also it's not just immigrants. So it happened in Argentina too. Is the local people suffer that because they worry about immigration changing their identity as well. So you can see a lot of white Americans or even Black Americans pushing back on immigration because they're worried. This is not how we used to be. Now if you go to Miami, it's like if you find a person that speak English, you're lucky, right? So
Yeah.
and in Argentina the same. I know my podcast. Someone accused me from promoting immigration. By the way, from
Mm.
Argentina. From Argentina.
Okay.
I'm not promoting immigration. I'm just like to talk about story and these kind of issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is what's interesting about immigration too. And of course, there are lots of debates here, and this is another topic that people get really defensive about. And it's something that's affecting many places. Pretty much all of the global north is experiencing immigration, an influx of immigration and migration from various places. But I mean, obviously, in South America, this has happened. This happens all throughout Africa. And the fact of the matter is, whether people like it or not, migration is natural. In many communities, like if we think about Central Asia, for example, those are nomadic communities. Okay, we have them divided up into nation states now, and that's
Right.
sort of the norm that we've set up in our society today. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that for the vast majority of history, before nation states even became a thing, migration was the most natural thing that happened. Now people will say that I'm promoting migration. I'm not
Right.
necessarily, okay? I'm just saying that it's a natural tendency for humans to leave for one reason or another, either because of necessity or maybe they're experiencing a famine in their area. They have to migrate somewhere else in order to have access to food and water, or whether that's because of the climate issues or war or whatever. I mean, there are so
Right.
many reasons. And even in my situation, I didn't move to Italy because of necessity. Okay, I moved because I wanted to. But that's not, I would probably be considered an anomaly. I think the vast majority of people move to another place because of necessity, right?
Right. And yes, I think the majority probably that's the case. But a lot of people like yourself, they just want to learn. I'm passionate about culture, and when I migrated to the US, I came to the US as an investor. I didn't come here because I was having financial problem. So
Mhm.
things did not work out for me the way I expected. If you go into a country, if you don't understand culture and their language, and you're going to invest money, you're gonna lose big time. And that's kind of
Yeah,
what
for
happened
sure.
to me. I summarized what happened, but
Hmm.
um, yeah, people don't migrate for the same reason. The majority do.
Hmm.
For necessity. Happen people that go into Europe from Africa, the Middle East, right?
Yeah,
Or United States or Argentina, including even Mexico getting a lot of migration from Central America, other places.
sure.
Anyways, actually, look, I think I love our conversation. It was great. I wanted to have this conversation with you since are you into social stuff? Like, do you have any social study in you, like, or not?
Uh, you mean like a social,
No, like learning, social. What is called? There's a name for it. Social. Um,
like
there's a
social
degree.
sciences?
Yeah, social scientist. That's what I was saying.
Well, I guess I'm considered a social scientist. Um, currently, I'm going through a grad school program that talks about a lot of these issues, but my specific specialization is within migration and language. So yeah, that's why I'm really interested in this topic. Of course, I tie it into my personal identity because I also, like many people, come from an immigrant background, and I also have immigrated abroad. But yeah, I guess you could consider me a social scientist at this point. By the time I get this degree, I guess I can consider myself a social scientist.
No, well, a lot of the stuff we cover, including myself, it's all social related, right? So
Yeah, sure. Mm.
especially now with communication, where I'm able to talk to you in Italy, learn about you and so many other people. It's very interesting. Actually, look, I don't want to take more of your time. I really enjoy having you on my podcast. Thank you. I love the conversation. Hopefully, we can do more of this down the road.
I would love that. Yeah.
I
Thank you
hope
so
everything
much
goes
for
well for
having
you in
me.
Italy, and Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for being flexible about the schedule because it was hard coordinating with such a huge time difference, but thank you, I appreciate it so much, and thank you for considering me. This was really interesting.
Not a problem. Thank you.